So it's 11 o'clock and I'm going to get started now. Thank you so much for coming to this session. The attendees who have come into the room and also the four panelists that we have. And thank you very much for the IM Division's leadership team, especially Gracia, Bill, Alex, and Luis for making this happen. My name is Becky Reuber, and there I am in a pre-pandemic hairstyle. And I'm really excited about this session. So my opening remarks will be brief. Digitization has been enabling internationalization for decades, of course. So it's not really a new phenomenon, but as it has moved from the back office to the front office and become increasingly an essential characteristics of products and services, people are doing new things in new ways. And this session was prompted by the observation that although qualitative methods are ideal for studying new and emerging phenomena, published work in this area has largely been dominated by research based on quantitative methods. So here we want to highlight some qualitative research that has been done. You can see 4 speakers on this slide. Since we only have 70 minutes, they're limited in the details that they can provide about their studies. Luckily, the studies have all been published, so you can find the details afterwards. Instead, our goal here is to encourage more qualitative research in this area. So the speakers are going to provide an overview of what they are doing and have done and why, with a particular focus on the phenomenon and the research questions that are well suited to qualitative methods, and also the methodological challenges that they've encountered. They'll speak in the reverse order of the extent to which we expect their topic and their methods to be familiar to this. Yeah, better that person better turn their audio off. To which we expect their topic and their methods to be familiar to this international management audience, starting with organizational level inquiries. So the order will be Esther, Katherine, Felipe, and Audra. I'm hoping that there'll be time for 1 or 2 questions after each speaker, and we'll also have time for 10-15 minutes worth of questions at the end. Please use the chat for questions and I will monitor it. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Esther to take it away.
And thanks so much. Thanks so much, Becky, and thanks everyone for joining us. So really, I suppose, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Really delighted to be here today. And what I would like to do is, I suppose, share a couple of reflections on a program of work that we have been doing on the multinationalization of digital firms, specifically SaaS firms. But it's really a program of study with a couple of collaborators. So at this stage, I would also like to acknowledge Sinead Monaghan from Trinity College Dublin, and Nicole Coviello, who we co-published with, and also Becky. They're growing, expanding, and undergoing really an internal transformation. So sometimes it was hard to even keep up with them, I suppose, in terms of what is happening. And that's obviously critical, trying to keep up with it, because you want to ensure accuracy and completeness of your data. I also felt we had sometimes get our head around how to deal with time and process, because theoretically what they were doing may seem fast, for them it's the norm, right? So again, what does it mean in terms of our conceptualization of time and pace and process? I think there's some interesting questions that can be answered. And we also had to really figure out how to deal with the malleability and frequent adjustments of digital artifacts. Obviously, they can be tweaked and altered relatively easily at low cost, typically at low cost also. But what does it mean conceptually? Are we talking about an evolutionary adaptation? Are we talking about an innovation? Are we talking about a local adaptation or localization? I mean, these are really conceptual questions that we had to work through with our data. So with that, I hope I have given you, I suppose, an initial overview of the types of work that we have undertaken. And then I'm looking forward to your questions and also hearing what my other panelists have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Esther. I don't see any questions in the chat yet. So if you have one for Esther, put it in quickly in the time it takes me to introduce the next speaker. So I'd like to introduce her now, Katherine Tatarinov from University of Geneva. So take it away, Katherine.
Thank you very much, Becky, and thank you, Esther. I think Esther's presentation really set the scene very well. I think we all share a lot of the opportunities and challenges, especially that she highlighted at the end. So I'll speak about one paper here. This is a paper, I'll tell the story of this paper. It's qualitative methods, obviously focusing on digital transformation of a very specific context. This paper is forthcoming at the Journal of International Business Studies, JIBS. It's co-authored with Professor Tina Ambos and Professor Ted Chang. And it's called Scaling Digital Solutions for Wicked Problems. And we take an ecosystem perspective for this paper. So Becky already introduced me, so no need to introduce myself. And I'll get right into the context. So what makes this paper special is actually the context. It's a very unusual context that we're working with that's non-traditional in IB work. So we looked at the United Nations, actually. And what made this context special is that it's very bureaucratic, it's very hierarchical, they have this very rigid culture, but on the flip side, they have these social missions, they need to do good, and they're nonprofit. But then they have these stakeholders, they're multilateral, they have governments as stakeholders, and they're feeling a lot of pressure to innovate and to use digital technology to do so. So when we think about digital transformation for very risk-averse organizations such as the UN, it's particularly interesting to study in this context. We had this quote from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, that really kicked off the phenomenon for us and made us think about what is digital technology and what is the UN's role in this digital technology. And you can read the quote there. He really mentions that it's a way to work across disciplines and actors, but they need to understand what are the different roles when this digital technology starts to shape history. And so as we started to research this and started to speak to people at the UN and learn about what they were doing with digital technology, we saw that for the UN, for their missions, they're addressing wicked problems like hunger, wicked problems like poverty, wicked problems like refugee migration that are very difficult to solve. And the way that they are manifesting digital transformation is that they are using digital solutions to solve these problems. But you cannot solve these problems at a local level. You need to solve them at a global level. And so scale, we saw, became increasingly important. And so our phenomenon and theoretical motivation then became scaling digital solutions and what this means, because these digital solutions are embedded in ecosystems of actors. It's not just the UN driving this. They're working with multinational corporations. They're working with NGOs, they're working with local players. So what are these ecosystems and what do these look like? And so Esther mentioned one definition of scaling, and we take a slightly different definition of scaling. We look at the scaling of a product or service in the MNC. So this is not a business model replication, it's the scaling of a digital solution, so a product almost. But in the literature, it says that there's this replication adaptation dilemma. And we wanted to see how does digital change this replication adaptation dilemma. And then on the ecosystem side, we wanted to see what does it mean to actually internationalize an ecosystem? What does it mean to scale an ecosystem in this new digital world? Before we got into the research, we needed to understand what is a digital solution. So we needed to define it. And I think this is one of the challenges when you're doing qualitative work, and I'll mention this again at the end, is really understanding what you're looking at, what is your unit of analysis, and what are you measuring? And so for us, it was necessary to define what is a digital solution, and how we defined it is that these are innovations suited to solve complex problems in a different way using digital technology. And we found that there was 3 characteristics in which they differed from technologies, like hardware. This was that they were layered and modular. So I'll give one example. The World Food Programme developed a blockchain initiative to provide cash-based transfers to refugee populations. This was a blockchain solution, but it was able to plug into the existing digital identity iris scanning technology that these refugee camps were already using from the UNHCR. And so it was able to plug in, it was modularly able to change in this way. It's generative, meaning that it's able to expand into and integrate with many domains, such as the internet, which means it works better the more people are using it. You have more data points, more connections. And finally, there's the affordances, which many of you studying this have already probably looked at. So it's different action possibilities. You're using the blockchain that was created for something else to now deliver cash-based transfers to the refugee population. So our question is really, how are digital solutions for wicked problems scaled across locations, and how are their ecosystems reconfigured? Now getting into the crux of what today's discussion is about. So why did we choose qualitative methodology for this? This is because this was a phenomenon that has never been studied in IB research before, and we needed to establish that it actually existed. Do these UN organizations actually create digital solutions? So we chose qualitative to compare and contrast cases and elevate emergent insights similar to Esther. What was different is that since this had never existed, we used a snowballing sampling technique where we mapped all digital solutions that the UN were doing and then picked which ones, kind of narrowed down our sample, which ones were scaling, which ones we were able to follow and get data on, and which ones were staying alive. So there was a survival there as well. And we conducted 3 years of interviews with 4 initiatives from UN organizations. These had to be based on frontier technology, so artificial intelligence, blockchain, geospatial mapping, or chatbots, had to be beyond the proof of concept phase and scaled to at least 2 locations. We conducted 24 interviews. We spent a lot of time with these UN organizations, and we kept going back and forth with them to make sure that as we were writing up these individual case studies, they were validating them in real time and they could work with us on this. What was interesting is we did not sample the actual initiative, we sampled the ecosystem. So for example, this is a sample. These were our 4 samples. These were the ecosystem maps. It was not just the initiative and how the initiative evolved, it was the actual ecosystem at each location. So here's one zoomed in. This is the World Food Program one that I mentioned. You see it was piloted in Pakistan. This is what the ecosystem looked like there of the partners that were involved. And then how did that develop over time? So it's a little bit different than sampling just on the initiative. Obviously, you see it's longitudinal case studies. So we're able to go through time and look at how these initiatives scaled, single case analysis, comparing and contrasting, and then building theory on that. What did we find? We found that this replication adaptation dilemma and the way you define a digital solution is very nuanced once you start to scale. So the ecosystem changes in each location. The problem that the digital solution addresses can also change, but the technology backbone stays the same. And so we were able to identify the different roles involved. We were able to identify what roles those played in the ecosystem and how these evolve over time, how these scale. So here is just a brief table on the different roles. We see the orchestrator role, which is the role the UN took. We see the integrator role, which is the different partners that became involved in these initiatives. And finally, the complementers, which were on the ground. And our final conceptual model here, theoretical model, shows that the different properties of the digital solution that I mentioned at the beginning, this modularity, generativity, and affordances change the way in which these digital solutions are able to scale, either through replication, or this is where the ecosystem stays the same and what the tool is trying to address stays the same, or through different variances of that. So this paper really contributes to defining the roles in the ecosystems in different institutional contexts, but more importantly, it develops a typology of international scaling, which proposes how the specific properties of digital solutions relate to their replication and adaptation as they scale. And now to the question of this session, what are the opportunities and challenges? I think for us, the opportunities that we saw was that there was a much greater opportunity to explore with qualitative data. We were able to explore more nuance in what was going on and get deeper and find less intuitive things that we could potentially later test with quantitative research. So I think for us, the opportunities were really that we started just asking a very basic question in 2017 of, does innovation exist in the UN? And we ended up, showing digital solutions exist and they're scaling using ecosystems. So this leap was huge over 5 years. What was the challenge for us? It's moving from the phenomenon to the specific theory. So I think this is always very difficult in qualitative research, is where are you contributing? What academic conversation are you adding to? Rather than starting with the theory and then going to the phenomenon, I think it's, for us, this was the biggest challenge. And then, of course, in digital specifically, the access to data, people don't want to speak about risk. People don't want to speak about bias. People don't want to speak about the ethical dilemmas of artificial intelligence and what's happening in their organizations. So I think often getting this in very honest data was sometimes difficult, but building these relationships with these organizations, we were able to overcome that. So that's it. Thank you very much from me.
Okay, thank you, Katherine. That was another fascinating presentation. So we do have a question in the chat, which I'm going to pull up, which asks if the original ecosystem itself is it internationalizing, or is it being replicated or adapted in other settings? For example, are the original players present in new locations?
Thanks, Carlos. Yeah, it's a great question. So this actually was depended on which, this changed over time. So we call this ecosystem versatility. So the ability of the ecosystem to change as it scales. We actually saw ecosystem versatility as something that changed depending on the type of initiative that was involved. So the modularity and the generativity enabled the ecosystem to change over time. So digital solutions, specific properties, enabled this ecosystem to change and to have other partners plug into the ecosystem as it scales to different locations. So in some instances, it would be replicated, and in some instances, it would adapt to the local needs.
And then Audra has asked, how did you go about gaining access?
Sure. So this was it was multiple studies actually that were involved. And what was really interesting is we started doing focus groups at the university to bring these innovation champions together and collect data from them. And how we built the relationships is they were coming to the university to actually learn from each other. They were so excited to hear about what the other international organizations and their counterparts in the other sister UN organizations were doing, that they started leaning on us as almost a platform to help connect them. And so that's how we built these relationships, is almost acting as a platform to bring them together and help them learn from each other.
And so, one of the things that Esther mentioned was just the time span, and digitization and digital objects change faster than you can collect data, and our research projects are fairly long in nature. Did you find, was that an issue, say, between 2017 and when you wrote the first version of the paper?
Absolutely. I mean, we had some of the initiatives, and one of them in the paper actually was spun off eventually because it was a high-risk artificial intelligence initiative, and the management of that specific organization decided not to pursue it. So I think it's always the case when you're dealing with digital solutions that something will move quicker than academic work, and you will have difficulty with the longitudinal data.
Yeah, and you talked about the challenges and the contributions. So Esther, I'm going to go back and ask you about that as well. Did both of you, and I'm sort of taking a little segue here, both of you have published in journals that this IM audience knows well. And so I'm wondering, Esther, do you have any comments on that, just in terms of the challenges in getting this through the review process?
Yeah, sure. And it's I think it's always obviously demanding, I suppose, to publish in these top tier journals. In terms of process and getting it published, I think in our case, we felt we had a really strong method. I mean, it was a solid method that helped overall. And, obviously there are always some limitations, but overall the method was solid. And we tried to, I suppose, preempt a lot of the typical challenges or typical questions that may be raised around method, but it was really then the theorization. I mean, trying to get this theorization right, and what Katja also mentioned, really picking a very specific audience. And I think some of it only became clear in the review process, or became clearer through the review process as to what kind of exact conversation that may be. With that GSJ paper that I mentioned, it was only really in the review process when we were encouraged to really focus strongly on tensions, the main strategic tensions that international firms face, where they really pushed us, okay, go back to the classics, go back to the transnational management, Bartlett and Gosha, go back to Prahalat's and Dosa's and colleagues' work on integration responsiveness. And that really focused us. But yeah, but I would say it's probably a general observation for most qualitative work. I would say, I wouldn't necessarily say it has to do with the digital conversation. That would be my sense, Becky.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, so there are lots of questions here, and what I'm going to do is we're going to go on, and some of them are general across different studies, so I'm going to come back to them at the end. And now I'm going to say, take it away, Felipe. So we've got Felipe Massa from Loyola University in New Orleans. Sorry, I'm tongue-tied today.
No worries. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. All right. So thank you very much. Thank you, Becky, for the invitation. My name is Felipe Massa, and I'm at Loyola University in New Orleans. This is my first time actually speaking to the IM audience, so I really appreciate the opportunity to speak outside of OMT and the ENT division, which is usually where I live. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, following the guidance from Becky, on field research in this digital context. And I'm going to focus very specifically on triangulation, which is, I think, a term that we use in qualitative research. And we sort of lay down a couple of citations and just say we did it, but we don't actually explain how we did it. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. And maybe with that focus, we can all take something away from the presentation. I'm also building on, since I'm not in this subfield, I wanted to pick up on some calls that have been made in the field, particularly by Nielsen et al., suggesting the incorporation of triangulation in multiple methodologies and to broaden the horizons of the field. So this is kind of exciting to do this kind of qualitative work in a digital realm to try to expand the methodological horizons. So again, great opportunity. And the paper that I'm going to be using to talk about the methods today is a paper that I published this past year with Siobhan O'Mahony. She's currently at BU and couldn't be here today, but sends her regards. It's a paper on this collective called Anonymous. Some of you might have heard of Anonymous before. They are hacktivists of sorts, trolls. There are many different names for what you call them, but my focus was largely on how these individuals across many different countries, speaking many different languages, with many different approaches to how to engage in protest, were actually able to organize themselves in the absence of any sort of at least visible managerial control. And that was the question that sort of got me started in this. And this paper is a paper that was originally from my dissertation, and I defended over 10 years ago, and it only got published this past year. So I can talk a little bit about the problems that came with publishing about this group, getting through IRB, getting through, getting letters from the FBI to be able to publish this stuff. So I can talk about that in the future. Good. And because this is such an esoteric context, I wanted to also point out that there are a lot of firms that are building systems so that distributed individuals can work across boundaries without managers per se, right? And Valve is one of those companies, as well as other organizations and pseudo organizations out there that try to organize without visible management, either to protect their own structure or to try to do things for a philosophical way, in a way that isn't hierarchical. So that's the sort of setting for this. And we see a lot more of this phenomenon of these non-managerial, self-organized groups emerging these days. And we see them in the news and we see them on TV, but rarely do they make it into journals. So that was our goal here. And the international aspect of this is in large part the idea that these groups, by their nature and by the fact that they engage across boundaries in different kinds of protest actions, tend to be international. And I'll talk a little bit about the international factors about this later in the presentation, but I want to show you a figure that brings us back to this idea of triangulation. How many of you have cited triangulation in your papers and just put JIC 1979 there, or Denzin 2006, and never really talked about how the triangulation actually happened? I think a lot of us have, and especially all of us in qualitative research talk a lot about triangulating, but we don't talk exactly about what we triangulate. And I think in this paper, we had to triangulate a lot of different things in order to understand this group that organized protest actions anonymously across boundaries in these very limited platforms where you didn't really know each other's names. We had to collect data in a bunch of different ways in order to make our argument that we were actually capturing these activities, right? And the first form of triangulation is one that we typically don't think of, but it's the first author, the second author doing data collection and data analysis. But we had sort of a third helper, which was an algorithm that was constantly scraping, crawling and scraping on the internet and collecting data. It was this, third data collector that we programmed ahead of time, but we didn't really have any idea what this collection was going to bring. So a lot of our data from this study didn't come from me or from Siobhan going out there and collecting data. It came from this automated protocol that we set up ahead of time. We also, triangulated these online interactions that we collected online with protest observations and archive media. So we looked contemporaneously and we looked back using various tools. We also use various methods to do this research, including ethnographic, where we went to protests and we did interviews, and ethnographic stuff where we were online collecting data, as well as archival and historical data collection. Last but not least is this idea that in order to understand this phenomenon that was very new, we also had to triangulate insights from different theories. All right, and that's at the core of it all. And I agree that one of the challenges of qualitative research, especially when you're dealing with a phenomenon that is weird and new, is translating it back to theory and connecting that. So a lot of moving parts in this research, but each part was necessary in order to understand what was going on and capture the multiple perspectives of the different people participating in this collective over time. And as we proceeded, what you really get is this engagement from all the people involved in data collection, coming up with an impetus, collecting data, and then analyzing it using all kinds of different forms of triangulation along the way to come up with insights. And we usually don't portray this visually because it's stress-inducing, I think, to see it, but it's really important to capture this, what stops and what starts at what point, and how do we then integrate all this data together, and the effort that it takes to put all of this together. What I actually show in the paper is much simpler and easier to understand, but it's not really an accurate portrayal of what goes on behind the scenes. One important difference in terms of what we can do online is that data never really dies online. So we could go back in time and capture a lot of what was going on with this group 8 years back, 6 years back, on demand. So we have the combination of archive data that we could go back to and the constant pouring in of contemporaneous data that's being generated by this group. So the decision of when to start and when to stop our research is really tricky. So as we're collecting this data, new events happen, new things happen. So this decision of when to stop and when to start becomes problematic. eventually we collected all kinds of different data that allows us to periodize what was happening in this collective in terms of what we were interested in was answering the question of how do these distributed participants really get organized. So we captured it all in phases, looked at major changes, tipping points between the phases that would allow us to have a better understanding of how it happens, and eventually, captured how different practices individually were adopted and dropped over time. And what we see is a move from very normative-based organizing controls to what we call architectural controls or participation architecture, which just means that they've created this forum program, this forum that essentially drives people to certain topics and to certain things. And as they get more expertise and more experience, it allows them greater and greater access. So that's what we found over time. And we have many pictures explaining how this happened and how eventually what was a very ad hoc group of protest actions with different participants became much more organized and turned into the cell networks that we see in terrorist organizations, that we see in all kinds of network organizations. So we capture the formation of that from scratch, which I think is what was innovative about this work. And what makes it really international is that a lot of these cells were from different countries or mixed people from different countries working together, even though they didn't know each other. So a few takeaways for IM scholars specifically. Be selective, all this automation that we used has the potential to decrease bias. The crawler was always awake, so there was no time zone bias in terms of our data collection. There was always activity going on in this organization, but it can be overwhelming. I think you can ask any qualitative researcher that how overwhelming data analysis can be. It's even more overwhelming when you have this constant inflow of digital data coming in, and parsing and organizing all of that was maybe one of the biggest challenges. The key here was to, be really organized, keep track of all the sources and time zones and all these things that came along with the data. And, one thing that was interesting is that in a lot of these places, even though they were organizing a protest action in Romania, everybody was speaking English because nobody knew that the other people in the room were not, American or were not international. So they defaulted to this lingua franca of English. And occasionally you see memes pop up that are from in other languages or from other countries, but there is this globalist norm in the organization, which I found was really interesting and something that I think would be interesting to look in the future in these algorithmic type of platforms where the norm is English, the visibility of international is not there necessarily, and it gets lost in the shuffle. So I thought that was interesting and something that might be appealing to you guys. And thank you very much. The rest of the paper is online. It's a little complicated to present in this short amount of time, but please check it out and reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have any questions or right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's great. So one thing when you showed the diagrams, and they're essential, I'm sure, to transmitting the meaning of things, and all the speakers so far have shown diagrams or figures, and they are so essential to qualitative methods. I'm just wondering, do you have any tricks about how to do them? I mean, I'm sure you've sat at your desk thinking, how am I starting with boxes and arrows or circles, and that doesn't work, and then so do you have any tricks for, like, PowerPoint's limited? I don't think yours were necessarily drawn with PowerPoint, were they?
They were.
Okay, you're.
I know. And I regret it to this day, not taking some sort of Photoshop or Illustrator course that I think would have helped me a lot. in this situation. But yes, all of those were done on PowerPoint. I'm slowly transitioning to Canva as my undergrads push me in that direction.
Okay.
But, you know, I think the key for me is every time I feel that the complexity is there to warrant a figure, and in a lot of cases for this paper in particular, since all of these topics, understanding platforms and understanding all these inflows of information, I love figures for showing inflows and outflows of information, anything like that, where there's directionality and temporality. I find that a figure does a better job than text. But I'm hoping one of these days there will be an amazing organization research methods paper that just talks about data visualization that is appropriate for the kinds of things that we show.
Yeah, in my qualitative methods group, there are people that actually bring in graphic designers, which is an expensive solution, but you know, to put what they see. So just because of that, the massive data, Esther has a question. You know, you mentioned a lot of moving parts in the research process, and she's wondering how did it settle into an order for you? If you could, is there, you know, a way you can talk about that process, and also in the context of your big data, because you had a lot of data to try to wrap your head around.
Yeah, I think I can talk a little bit about periodization, which is, I think, something that is challenging for people in general. How do you decide where the markers happen? In the case of Anonymous, there were very clear fallouts and schisms and things that were events that drove me to create these markers, and where the way in which they organized fundamentally changed across these periods. Sometimes when I'm reviewing qualitative work, I see unnecessary periodization, right? That people just think the paper looks better, the findings section looks better when you have 3 periods, right? So I tend to really look for, okay, is there a real reason to periodize this data? Did something related to the research question fundamentally change? Because sometimes we just periodize because, oh, the time changed, or there's 10 years, 10 years, 10 years, whatever it is, right? In this case, Anonymous went from being very ad hoc to then having some structure to then being fully architectural in how they controlled behaviors, in terms of creating their own little video game where people went into this platform and participated. So the way in which they answered the research question across time changed. And that allowed me to decide, okay, this was important. And, you know, I noticed that as the way they organized changed, the inflows and outflows of data and what I could collect and couldn't and where changed as well. So I had multiple rationale for why I periodized.
Okay, thank you. And so with that, we're going to move on to Audra Wordle from the University of Maryland.
Great, let me share screen. Does everybody see it okay?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, great. This has been such a fantastic session, and I'm excited to also be able to participate. So thank you, Becky, and everybody for all your efforts in putting this together. So I'm Audra Wormald, recently finished up my PhD program at the University of Maryland just 2 weeks ago, and we'll be starting at UNC Chapel Hill in another couple of weeks. And so today I'm going to talk to you about this sort of body of work on the mobile money industry that's comprised my dissertation. So I want to start by taking us back in time to 1995. Worldwide at this time, there were 2.3 billion individuals who were considered unbanked. And in sub-Saharan Africa alone, 80% of the population was considered unbanked. So these are individuals who don't access formal financial institutions like bank branches or ATMs, and they typically relied only on cash. And it's within this context that mobile money became a novel way in which individuals started to be able to access financial services via very basic mobile phones, kind of like the one shown here, that typically cost less than 30 USD. And so unlike Venmo, PayPal, Apple Pay, some platforms that you and I might be more familiar with, These types of mobile money platforms do not require the user to have a formal bank account. And so the process actually looks a little bit like this. An individual will take cash to her local mobile money agent, who then adds the cash into her mobile money account, which she can then access via her phone. And then she can transfer this money from her account to another person who also uses the same mobile money platform using basic text messaging through USSD or SMS types of technology. So by 2021, there were 1.35 billion registered mobile money accounts. And as you can see from this chart, which is the number of mobile money platforms launched worldwide, this industry has clearly emerged and diffused and has helped improve access to financial services for the unbanked. So not only is mobile money an important phenomenon to study as a digital solution to a critical social problem, but it also represents a unique opportunity to learn about industries based on digital platform ecosystems, as well as firm strategies for internationalization and industry emergence across countries that vary in market supporting institutions. So I have 3 papers together that take a deep dive into this phenomenon of the mobile money industry's emergence. And I think the methods of all 3 of these papers will be of interest to this particular audience. The first one is actually published in SMJ, so you can go and take a look at it if you want. I'm actually going to spend the majority of today's time talking about this 3rd paper, which is still a working paper. So in this paper, I'm trying to understand how does institutional variation affect industry emergence. So as an industry emerges, we know from prior literature that it typically follows this life cycle depicted here. And in each of these different stages of emergence, there's a diverse set of actors that need to build their knowledge to address uncertainty that's occurring across multiple dimensions. And the literature highlights 4 main dimensions of uncertainty: technology, demand, ecosystem, and institutions. And so what I'm looking at in this paper is understanding this institutional aspect of uncertainty. And relatively less work has been done in this space to understand how institutional uncertainty and how different kinds of institutions matter for industry emergence. And this is because a lot of the prior industry studies are largely based on single country contexts, with the implicit assumption that all firms encounter the same set of country level market institutions. And so because of this, these studies are unable to examine variation in market institutions that might differ from country to country. And so when we're starting to think about born global industries or these types of digital industries that can span countries, we need to re-examine these kinds of assumptions. Furthermore, much of the research on industry emergence has focused on empirical contexts in developed countries, predominantly the US and Europe, where strong market supporting institutions like protected property rights and robust judicial and financial systems can be taken as given. But as we all know, this is very different in developing country contexts, which are often characterized by institutional voids. And so institutional voids can make it much more difficult for firms to enter into these contexts where there might be missing or dysfunctional market institutions, things like regulations that are either too strict or too lenient, a judicial system that enforces these laws unpredictably, or problems related to corruption. So theoretically, what I'm arguing in this paper is we need a better understanding in the industry emergence literature as to how these institutions might influence industry emergence. So to answer that question, I'm trying to unpack a couple of sources of institutional uncertainty. So in general, institutional uncertainty refers to this incomplete knowledge about the social and formal institutions that specify interactions between different kinds of actors and dictate their patterns of exchange. And we know that institutions is a very broad concept that's been thought about by a variety of scholars: economics, sociology, management. So in my paper, I'm bounding my focus to the new institutional economics understanding of institutions as constraints on organizations, and specifically looking at uncertainty as it relates to formal institutions. So first sorts of uncertainty that I'm thinking about relates to formal institutions that exist within a country prior to an industry's emergence. So these are the so-called rules of the game that set some of these initial conditions in which a nascent industry might emerge. So for example, these are things related to the quality of regulations, the degree of state intervention via direct ownership into, say, banks or other types of organizations, rule of law, levels of corruption, things like that. Then the second source of uncertainty I'm looking at can stem from industry-specific institutions. And these are the specific rules that need to be created for a new industry, namely regulations. And in regulated industries in particular, industries like financial services, pharmaceuticals, different types of energy sources, right? The existing institutional framework and the uncertainty around how it might change is particularly salient. Firms need to be legally compliant in order to operate, but in a nascent industry, these industry-specific regulations may not yet exist. So uncertainty exists around whether the regulator will introduce new industry-specific regulations, or whether and how the regulator may apply existing regulations of adjacent industries to the new industry. And so for mobile money specifically, as an industry that's at the convergence of telecommunications and financial services, this is really relevant. So separately, these are two of the most highly regulated industries worldwide. And when you mash them up together, as you do in mobile money, there is a number of regulatory concerns that these countries' regulators know will be needed to be addressed at some point down the road. So ex ante, there's a great deal of regulatory scrutiny of mobile money, and there's a lot of uncertainty as this industry emerges as to when and how these different countries' regulators will act. And since I'm thinking about this emergence of this industry across multiple countries, I don't want to assume that these countries are uniform in their approach to developing regulations specific for mobile money. So this paper really digs into this interaction between these pre-existing market institutions and the regulatory approach taken to developing these industry-specific institutions for mobile money as it's emerging. So in order to answer this research question, I am relying on a hand-collected panel data set from 1996 to 2017 for the 54 countries in Africa. And to create this comprehensive longitudinal data set, I rely on three main categories of data. So the first main category is archival quantitative data compiled from several different data sets that already exist. So some different data sets from the World Bank, from the IMF, or from the GSMA, which is the Mobile Network Operators Industry Association. And so compiling this data together gives me country level data on these pre-existing market institutions for the 54 countries in my sample, as well as the census of mobile money firm entry across these countries. Then the second category of data I rely on is text-based archival data. And so this involved me collecting lots and lots of pages of first-person founder accounts, legal documents, industry reports, and I'm somewhat lucky in studying mobile money since it's a relatively recent phenomenon. A lot of these materials are available online or in some sort of digital format. And so putting this together, I had panel data at a fairly high level related to the timing in which mobile money specific regulations came about for the 43 countries in the African continent that had at least one mobile money entrant during the sample period. Then these data I supplement with semi-structured interviews that I've conducted with firms and regulators and policy experts. And I rely on this primary data to obtain some relevant background information related to understanding how regulators interacted with firms and start to suggest some different mechanisms at play for the quantitative patterns I observe. And so I'm taking an abductive approach to analyze these different types of data in order to make inferences to the best explanation. So Esther and Katherine today took more of an inductive approach, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with the typical hypothesis testing deductive approach. So I want to talk to you today more about this inference to the best explanation abductive approach. So some of the pros and cons. One of the pros of this approach, I think, is it's quite well suited to my research question, given that there's limited theory and limited empirical evidence on my country. And the way it worked is I started with the quantitative data to be able to establish some different associations and patterns. And then I relied on the archival and primary qualitative data to help provide contextualization for these patterns and to help rule out plausible alternative explanations for the patterns that I observed. And in this way, kind of combining and using this triangulation approach that Felipe talked about, able to make these inferences to the best explanation. Now, I want to be careful to note that the analyses in my study are all correlational, right? I'm not claiming any sort of causality due to several sources of endogeneity, but in combining and layering these different types of data, I have a lot more confidence in the inferences that I'm making. And there's a lot of calls for kind of alternative types of research using mixed methods or alternative ways to run some quantitative analyses. So here's just one from ASQ that I pulled. Papers using quantitative analyses could benefit from more variation. We present this call for a richer and more flexible presentation of evidence to make sure our authors do not constrain their papers unnecessarily. So that's so I think we're seeing some of this interest in these alternative methods in the leading journals. Some of the cons of this approach, it was very time intensive to collect this type of data, as some of the other panelists have mentioned also. One of the big trade-offs I faced was in terms of what kind of analyses I wanted to do, depth versus breadth. So I made a research design decision to focus more on breadth in order to study 50+ countries in Africa. But this meant that I was not able to really go deep into the content of what these regulations looked like and really absorb the qualitative differences in regulation across these different types of countries. So I think that opens up some opportunities for follow-on work, but something to think about and something I've been noticing going through the review process is kind of providing the rationale for the methods I used and the analyses I put into play. And I think another challenge that I actually don't have on the slide here is describing the method itself. So since it is not one of the tried and true templates that we sort of see, being able to clearly explain it in a paper has taken a good amount of time. A little bit more about the abductive approach. It asks the analyst to engage with models and data in an iterative and dynamic process using multiple models and sources of data in a back and forth, where both the models and the data are augmented as learning evolves. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about abduction or inferences to the best explanation, I've got a couple of references on this slide for you and a couple of empirical examples where this approach is used. So I can also put those in the chat when I'm done here. So I will just quickly wrap up because I think I'm out of time. I won't really get into the findings of the paper itself, but contributions. This paper is revealing the ways in which institutions can facilitate and impede industry emergence and innovation diffusion. And so I find that industry emergence wasn't just based on which firms launched these entrepreneurial platforms, but also the degree to which regulatory institutions emerged to support this industry. And so to the best of my knowledge, this study is the first to examine the evolution and impact of regulation in a nascent industry while taking advantage of the fact that the mobile money industry emerged almost simultaneously in multiple countries. And so in doing so, I can differentiate between the role of these pre-existing country level market institutions and the industry specific institutions for mobile money for the industry's emergence. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Audra. So someone has sent to me a question asking, asking about the languages and how did you deal with the different languages in the data set?
Yeah, so actually that was quite interesting. A lot of, especially like the different legal texts, it seems the predominant languages were English or French. So that was nice. I didn't have to encounter lots of, 54 different languages. so with the French ones, I worked with someone to translate some of those. And again, because I was more focused on breadth as opposed to depth, the information I was looking for was more high level as to the timing of when these regulations came out. So yeah.
Okay, and then just sort of to follow up, just when you're talking about breadth and depth, is, everyone loves mixed methods studies, but then they want you to have the same amount of rigor on both sides, which can be really tough. And so I just wondered, if you encountered that in the review process and how you might have gone around, like how you might have overcome those challenges.
Yeah, so that's still an ongoing challenge that I'm working through. So I don't have a great answer yet, but I think I'm trying not to sell it as a mixed methods paper. I'm trying to sell it as this abductive paper. And so the primacy really goes onto the quantitative patterns with the qualitative data to contextualize it, as opposed to having to have a full-blown qualitative inductive type of.
Right. Okay. So a question that was asked of Esther and Katherine at the beginning was, how do you compare qualitative data on disparate cases when the data is different for a different case? The data you have is different for different cases. So, for Esther, for you, it would be different firms. Katherine, for you, it would be different solutions. Audra, for you, it would be different countries. I'm sure the documentation varies. Felipe, for you, it would be different phases. And so when people are looking at qualitative research with a quantitative mindset, they're looking for standardization across the units of analysis, but of course the data is different in each. And I'm just wondering if any of you have some comments on that.
I can try. I think the first thing I tend to standardize are the questions that I'm asking across the different settings, whatever it is. So even if it was looking at different protest actions or attacks across phases, I try to maintain the similar questions, which is also helpful when you have multiple people working on the same paper to really focus on the protocol and have at least a semi-structured protocol that you're being guided by. And then I think the second piece of that is to make, like Kathy Eisenhart would tell you this, make sure that the cases are actually comparable to begin with, and you have a sort of North Star that's moving you there. Because if you go in fully grounded theory, right, fully inductive, and you're just opening yourself up to the possibility of findings, that's going to quickly get overwhelming, particularly in this digital context.
Okay. Anybody else have a?
Yeah, I might add maybe to what Felipe has said. So I would fully endorse everything that Felipe has mentioned around, I suppose, the protocol and having this North Star guiding you. And then when it maybe comes to the nuts and bolts of actually working with the data, and typically, we try to understand maybe the history or the timeline of events for each firm first, get a good handle on each case. And then we started to develop the constructs. But obviously it takes some time, right, before the constructs really settle. So at that stage also we started to compare and contrast across the organizations, and that also helped to see similarities, differences, which helped to settle the constructs. So it was iterative, but we started in essence that cross-case comparison quite early, and that helped. Yeah. Okay.
And I see in the chat that there's a discussion about the induction and then the abduction, Audra, that you brought out, and how did that emerge? And part of that is also related to an earlier question, and that is sort of to do with the phenomena. Like, do you start with the phenomena, or do you start with the theory. So did you start by saying, you know, global money markets are interesting phenomena, anonymous is an interesting phenomena, you know, Silicon Docs is an interesting phenomena, you know, these UN initiatives are interesting, or like, and how does that work sort of in terms of you know, your North Star, induction, abduction, and how does that all play out? So maybe Audra, do you want to?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, so for me, I started mostly with the data. I mean, it was somewhat simultaneous because I was interested in these nascent industries. But yeah, definitely starting with the data, had some overarching broad research questions in mind. Started with the census of the 20 or so pioneers of the industry, and they kind of built out from there as I got to know the context better and started working more in the literature where the gaps were in the theory. So very much all iterative, going back and forth.
Anybody else?
I can talk to that too. I think it's interesting because when I look back retrospectively at why I chose this, I say, okay, what was interesting at first was that there was this weird group of trolls attacking the Church of Scientology, and I had no idea what was going on or how they organized. But at the time when I was a PhD student, everything was institutional theory to me because I just had that hammer that I wanted to use across all the different perspectives. So to me, that was sort of a mix of, I had, you know, an understanding of this. So until I found the theory to match the phenomenon, I didn't really have anything. So it felt like I was grasping at straws until I really understood, you know, more about social movements, more about coordination, and had all the entire toolkit that I could pull from to really understand it.
Katherine, or do you have anything to add to that, or?
I think for us, it was a lot about what is the discussion we want to contribute to. And I think this is where this was kind of what I closed on at the end, is what are we really looking at? Because I think we had a huge data set of these initiatives and what was going on. And we really needed to narrow it down and say, okay, we only want to look at the digital solutions. We only want to look at their ecosystems. This is what's interesting. This is where we can make a contribution. And so it's really about narrowing that phenomenon down, kind of almost like a funnel approach. And seeing what can we find that's new there. So I think for us it was more like this than always having that North Star guiding us all the time. So I think we took it broader at the beginning.
Okay, we've got another couple of minutes, and Elena has a question, Esther, for you and I about our global scaling work. So do you want to take some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Elena had a couple of questions. So the question, is it a logic of multinationalization to a specific stage of a firm development? Yeah, no, I mean, conceptually, we see it as a logic of multinationalization, but acknowledging that it is a stage. Typically, firms don't globally scale indefinitely. There might be a certain starting point and an end point. So in that sense, it seems to manifest during a certain, sorry, the lights just went off in the office, during a certain stage during an organization's life. Does it mean that scaling is a multidimensional phenomenon? Yeah, I mean, we definitely see it as multi-dimensional, also in multidimensional, yes. Around rapid growth, global business model, and the replication logic. And yes, there could be different approaches that you can take, absolutely. I mean, even different theoretical lenses, maybe, to trying to understand certain facets of global scaling, for sure. I mean, in that particular paper that I explained a little bit more about, the key question that we were interested in was around the core strategic demands and how they're being managed, so to speak. And then we realized that there was this global scaling paradox. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, lots of opportunities there to do more research.
Okay, and I guess with that, we've just got a minute or two. remaining. All of these people are widely available online. So if you have questions about more specific questions about the research, you can ask them. You can find them to ask them. And certainly the research is published. I want to thank all of you. This has just been a fascinating session for me. I think it's, for qualitative researchers as journeymen, you're experts, but we're journeymen in doing this, and you've brought to the fore some of the working challenges of doing it, and yet the huge opportunities that can result in that. I hope that this session has encouraged some people who may be qualitative researchers, but have not ventured into this area to take the plunge. There's been a huge, you can see the diversity of research questions, all related to, international activity / business / management across the world. And there are challenges, to be sure, but there are also lots of opportunities. And so thank you all very much for coming to this session, and to the panelists for participating in it. So many thanks.